Good. Good evening to everyone. We would like to start off by thanking our sponsors. Our shir tonight is sponsored by Annie Weisblatt, and it's to commemorate the yahrzeits of our dear friend, her husband Aaron Gudel ben Nosson, the yahrzeit on the 28th of Tammuz. So we thank you for the sponsorship, and Neshama Shavan Aliyah. We'll remember our barn, and the loss is still felt. Also, we are grateful to our sponsor, to Sandy and Nochum Wolf, who are sponsoring to commemorate the yahrzeit of Sandy and Aviva was Nika's mother, Esther Hafmitz, Esther Bluma Bat Pinchas Vechana Miriam. Tammuz 22 is the yahrzeit, so we thank you as well. Neshama Shavan Aliyah from our words of Torah that we're going to be studying here tonight. So we're entering into the 9 days. It should bring some feelings to everyone. The concept of mourning for something that occurred 2,000 years ago. But our tradition teaches us not to view it as an historical event that happened to our people, but rather to make it relevant. Why do the rabbis want us? Why does tradition, why does the Talmud, why does halacha want us to make this event relevant? So Judaism in general does not believe in being negative about the past or negative about anything unless those feelings can be channeled in a positive way. In other words, when you go ahead and bring thoughts to mind and they affect your feelings, and then you could in turn do something positive with them, right? You could channel them to make a difference, then it's good. And by the way, even though we talk about the month of the 9 days as days of sadness, I do believe that when a person has an understanding that you are supposed to be sad, you're supposed to channel it and make a difference as a result, you suddenly realize that there's actually, paradoxically, something that makes you happy. Because when you know how to deal and channel those emotions and do something good with them, you should feel happy you're doing something that is meaningful with life. So therefore, yes, it's a time that we are mima'it besimcha, we minimize happiness, and there's an expectation that we are mindful of what this period is about, our history. But we focus on this idea that, yes, we have those feelings, but in turn, we're going to channel it in a positive way. What is the positive? Well, we analyze how the rabbis understood why the destruction occurred, and we try to fix that flaw. And it sounds simple, right? When our nation fell apart because of sinas chinam, to such an extent that there are commentators that note that by the time the Romans destroyed the Bet HaMikdash, the temple, it was really a shell, meaning it no longer had its sanctity, because we, in essence, destroyed it by not respecting one another, by not appreciating the contribution of those who do things a little bit differently, by not developing the maturity and the ability to deal with those who perhaps, don't treat us perfectly. It snowballs these things. When someone is a little bit harsh towards me, if I don't deal with it properly, I'll make the situation much worse. These are things that we have to work on. It brought about the churban, it brought about the destruction, so we focus on good things. And I could say that I'm very optimistic because I see a lot of good. I see a lot of good in this generation. And I'm in general an optimist that I think better things are waiting for our nation. In other words, that you have this organization. It's actually a former Torontonian that created this organization that is the Chafetz Chaim Heritage Foundation, where there's a tremendous focus on education and reminders about the importance of our words, of what we say about others. Shmiras haloshen, observing what we say, right? It's the caution that we must have due to the fact that we really understand how damaging words could be. So this is an organization that really brought Shmiras haloshen and the significance of Lashon Hara to the attention of everyone. We get reminders, so many reminders. So this is a real positive move, that there's a focus, a communal focus on let's be careful with what we say. The idea that we have tolerance in this generation, right? When a century ago, if you would walk into a shul and they have a specific nusach and someone walks in and says something a little bit different, they would go berserk. And today, we have this tolerance and understanding and even an appreciation that sometimes you go to a different nusach and you see, you know what, this was meaningful. It's not mine, but it was beautiful, and they're sticking to their traditions. This openness and this acceptance, there's a lot of good that's happening. And I always feel one of the things I'm missing out day in, day out is from the fact that we're not living in Eretz Yisrael. But when you are there and you hear stories of what's happening there, people in general are getting along. When you get information from the media, it doesn't sound as good, but they have their agenda. They're going to focus on the negative. Reality is that a lot of good is happening. So I think that we must enter into this journey of studying the halachos of the 9 days. And Jewish law does a tremendous job in identifying practices that really assist us in being mindful of the period. In other words, the 9 days halachot should never be studied as things that I try to do or I try to avoid or try to find a leniency. The goal for everyone must be that these are practices that are there as tools to get myself mindful of what the period is about. So, for example, if you have the practice of avoiding recorded music during the 3 weeks. So, it's hard to say that recorded music is something that the Talmud prohibited because it did not exist in Talmudic times. But for those who do avoid it, it's an opportunity that when you enter into your car and you can't turn on the 91.1 or the 96.3, and you have to go ahead and listen, or even better, shut off the radio for a few minutes, something occurs in the mind and you say to yourself, you know what, this is a reminder, I'm sad. Why am I sad? Once upon a time, we had this unifying structure. We don't have it. What can I do, right? And as a result of the mindfulness, when I do come to shul and someone agitates me a little bit, and I could go ahead and say, you know what, I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to calm down because I'm going to focus on Avas Yisrael and Achdus and all the good things that we're aware of. Mission accomplished. So these are ways of walking into these halachas, but we have to study them. And the first one we're going to begin with is the well-known statement, Mishenichnas Av Mema'atin Besimcha, right? You're familiar with that statement. That as the month of Av begins, you minimize your simcha. I've heard when we lived in Milwaukee many years ago, I remember one of the Rabbi Tversky's getting up and saying, it doesn't tell us to purge all happiness. It says to be mima'et the happiness. And for a Hasidic Jew, he sees it as a reminder that you have to be still happy. And it is true, but I think that the happiness we must have is not happiness that is external to boost us, but rather a very deep happiness that, again, as we are doing the right thing during this period of time, I am doing something meaningful, right? In 9 days from now, when Sunday comes, a week from Sunday and Tisha B'Av, and you're going to be hungry. You will be hungry. And, you feel a little bit weak. You can think about the fact that I am living and doing something meaningful. I have a deep desire to eat something. I could do it in a way that no one's going to know about it but HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and I'm avoiding it because I have a relationship with him and he wants me to mourn the loss. That is meaningful, and that is what should be providing the simcha. Now, the Talmud tells us that we have to be aware of the fact that it is a time that rea mazle, the mazel, unfortunately, is not good during this period of time. Many people avoid dangerous things. It is a time to be aware of our history, and as a result, due to the fact that we're plugged into our history, we're sensitive to our mazel. And therefore, the Talmud tells us that if there is a Jew who has a court case and he is dealing on the other side of things with a non-Jew, he should delay it until after this period of time. This is what we are told. And I remember in Buffalo, the story of a specific lawyer who told me that he once had trial and everything was supposed to go his way. It was a very easy case, but due to the fact that it was the 9 days, and if I remember correctly, it was actually Tisha B'Av, he told me everything went wrong. And he says that since then, he is very, very careful during the 9 days because he learned the hard way. So it is something that we remember. Our mazel is not the best during this period of time. Now, when does it end? When does it end? Even though the language seems to indicate that it's the whole month of Av, fact is, we follow the teaching of the Khatam Sofer, that by the 15th of Av, the mazel is good again. So we wait, like after Tisha B'Av, we still have this waiting that the 15th of Av arrives. It's a day of unity, it's a day of happiness, and it's a day when the mazel is good. Now, the significance of this period of time and the requirement to be mindful of what it's about, it appears was taken so seriously in some European communities that there was an old Ashkenazi minhag. And I do believe that if we would visit shuls in the 16th century in Poland and in Germany, the vast majority of people on Shabbos Chazon would not be wearing their Shabbos clothes. And this is a Ramah. The Ramah tells us, due to the fact that we are in a state of mourning, we wear our weekday clothes. That's what we are told. Now, that custom is no longer followed. I don't know if it's followed anywhere, but I do know that it was already questioned by Rav Yaakov Emden in the middle of the 18th century, and then again by the Vilna Gaon. And once the Vilna Gaon says that this is a problematic practice, you can no longer expect it in any Lithuanian shul or Lithuanian yeshiva. And due to the influence of the yeshivot, there is no such thing anymore. Everyone, as far as I know, wears Shabbos clothes on Shabbat Chazon. What changed? So there are those who want to argue that perhaps in the 16th century, the Shabbos clothes and the weekday clothes were similar. It happened to be that on Shabbos you had something that was newer and of higher quality. But as time changed and Jews had designated clothes for Shabbos that looked very, very different, so they no longer wanted to be wearing weekday clothes because that would be too obvious for Shabbos. And on Shabbos, by the way, there is a prohibition of expressing public mourning. There's a prohibition of avelut befaresia. You're not supposed to act as a mourner publicly on Shabbos. And therefore, the practice is to, yes, wear our Shabbos clothes. There are many shuls throughout the world that on the Lechadodi of Shabbos Chazon, they sing it to the niggin, to the tune of Eli Tzion. Lechadodi likras kalo, penei Shabbos nekab. Many shuls do it. There are those, especially in Israel, that are uncomfortable with it. Why are they uncomfortable with it? Avelut befaresia. This is not how you welcome Shabbos. I don't know. It would be interesting for me to know if anywhere in Israel it is done, but outside of Israel, I know it is. And for example, Chazon Ish was very much against it. So, by the way, when a Baal Tefillah would get up here and decide to do it or not do it, both ways work. If he is a Baal Tefillah who gets up for the L'chadodi and starts with the Eilit Tzionigin, I'll say, okay, he's very traditional. And if he's a Baal Tefillah who gets up and decides not to do it, I'll say to myself, okay, he comes from the school of honoring Shabbos and not wanting to express any Avelut on Shabbat. Two schools, every single one of them has its own very important message. Okay, now, among the things that are mentioned in Shulchan Aruch that are not done during the 9 days is what's known as Binyan Shel Simcha. An example I could think of is if, let's say, you decide that you want to build in your backyard a gazebo. To relax, it's pleasant. You sit outside in Toronto, the 2.5 months that the weather is nice. You want to go ahead and have a gazebo in your backyard. Now, it's not needed, but it's something to provide for you pleasure. That is something that you do not build during the 9 days. And so too, to beautify your landscaping, to beautify it. When it comes to planting flowers, that too, it appears halachically is avoided. On the other hand, to cut the grass or to weed out, so we are told here that Yitzchak Deutsch used to be the Baal Tefillah at Baal Bnei Torah and used the tune of L'chadod. So it was done at Bnei Torah. Okay, it's good to know the history. Both schools are okay. I think in general, in most shuls outside of Eretz Yisrael, it's done. Good to know a little bit of the history. So cutting the grass is fine. Beautifying your lawn is something that's avoided on the 9 days. And again, an opportunity to be mindful. It's not a time that we focus on enhancing nature and making it beautiful, but rather realizing what we've lost. So that's one halacha that we'll mention. Now, there is a statement in the Talmud that Shavua shechal bo Tisha B'Av, that the week of Tisha B'Av, meaning if you have a Tisha B'Av, for example, on a Thursday, so the week leading to that Thursday, the Talmud tells us, there's a prohibition of haircuts and kibus, which is translated as laundry. Now, Ashkenazim, and this goes back already to Rav Klonimus from Luka, right? It goes back already 1,000 years that Ashkenazim adapt these Talmudic laws that were stated only relating to the week of Tisha B'Av. We begin these practices of mourning already from the beginning of the 9 days. So therefore, we don't get our haircuts, and Ashkenazim, by the way, extended, as you know already, from Shivas Tammuz. But what's relevant for our discussion is the prohibition of kibus, of doing laundry. And there are 2 ways to understand it. Why would the rabbi say that during the 9 days, you don't do laundry? 2 explanations. One explanation is that the action, right, the activities that are needed to go ahead and clean your clothes and do the laundry are very time-consuming and very demanding. Think about 100 years ago when people would go down to the river, right, and have those boards, those slated boards with a big bar of soap. In our generation, we are coming back, Savar, okay. So remember the laundry of 100 years ago? That occupied your mind. It basically was an activity that your whole focus was how to do it right. And as a result, the rabbis were concerned that if a person would be doing laundry during the 9 days, there would be, listen to these words, hesech hadat. The mind would be moved away from focusing on what this period is all about, focusing on the morning, which it appears to me that the rabbis actually had an expectation that during 9 days, All we are thinking about is the destruction and the mourning due to the destruction and what we could do to fix the Khurban, which is very interesting. So the rabbis did not want you to have a laundry day because that would distract you from the avelut, from the thoughts of mourning that you are supposed to have. So that's explanation number one to the Talmudic statement, no kibbutz. Explanation number two is that the issue is actually wearing laundered clothes. You know, when you put on a pair of pants, right, or any garment, and it's freshly laundered and pressed, you feel good about it. That is what the rabbis want you to avoid during this period of mourning. Now, halachically speaking, number one, I grew up in a home, and this is a tradition that we have, that during the 9 days, we don't do laundry. That's the tradition we have. Now, one would say to me, wait a second. I understand going back 100, 200 years ago, when laundry, the action of laundry, the activities of laundry were very demanding and time consuming. I appreciate the fact that once upon a time there was a hesech hadat, there was a distraction. But nowadays, what kind of distraction is there? You throw it into the machine, you press a few buttons, and that's it. It's done. Is there a distraction today? So it appears that there's a minority school that actually believes that nowadays it's less of an issue. However, we are traditional, and that seems to be the approach. Although in a situation where there are young children and they make they get their clothes dirty more than you would want, obviously there's reason to be lenient. Another practice that I grew up with, and this is something I learned from my late father, alav shalom, is that during the 9 days, when it comes to shirts, you don't wear freshly laundered shirts. What we do is the day before, the days before the 9 days, we wear the shirt for a half hour and put it back on a hanger. And the result is that we don't have that enjoyment of something that is freshly laundered during the 9 days. So this is a practice that we had at home, and it's obviously based on this Talmudic statement. Now, so this another detail, which it's a little bit out of order, but I would like to just mention it as well. When it comes, for example, to music, meat, wine, all those things that we avoid during the 9 days, which we'll still cover, we extend it until midday, the 10th of Av, in general. In cases of need, there's leniency, but in general, we extend it. Why? Because we have to realize that although the Beis Hamikdash was burned on the 9th, tradition teaches us that it was towards the evening, and the majority of the structure was consumed by fire on the 10th of Av. To commemorate that, we Ashkenazim have the minhag that we extend the mourning, or the 9 days mourning, into midday of the 10th. Just one detail to mention. Now, there's a statement in the Jerusalem Talmud where there were two readings, okay, two traditions how to read it. And I'm going to read it to you both ways. Reading number one, Nahigi, Nashi, women have a custom, Delo lemishti imra. Women have a custom, the Jerusalem Talmud tells us, not to go ahead and lay out the warp threads in a loom. Now, based on that reading, what the Jerusalem Talmud is telling us is the following. During the 9 days, there is a tradition that women do not make garments. You don't make clothes. It was something that was the norm in the past. It is not a time to create. When we are supposed to be mindful of destruction, it's not a time to focus on something that is creative. As a result, women, for many, many centuries, did not do their sewing and crocheting during the 9 days. And so too, people in general, once you are not supposed to be making garments, they don't purchase garments, even those things that would not require a shechianu. So in general, an undershirt would not be purchased during the 9 days. Now, that is based on the reading of the word Imra with an Ein, which relates to Tzemer, okay? There's a second way of reading that statement of the Jerusalem Talmud, where we are told, Nahigi, that women have a custom, and it's not just women, it was everyone, Delo lemishti chamra, not to drink wine. And it works as follows. According to the Babylonian Talmud, there is no issue of drinking wine or eating meat during the 9 days. The prohibition of not eating meat and drinking wine is only for the last meal before the fast, the Suda Mafsekes. However, based on this reading of the Jerusalem Talmud, we are being told that the women, perhaps encouraged or perhaps were inspired, to teach us all not to drink wine during the 9 days. And as a result of rabbis trying to analyze why, and they came up with an explanation that wine reminds us of the libations, the nesachim that were done in the Bet HaMikdash. We should not be consuming that beverage at a time that we are mourning the loss of the structure and our inability to bring those libations. And once wine is avoided, it is logical to avoid meat as well. And therefore, for many, many, many centuries, Klal Yisrael has the minhag of avoiding wine and meat, which includes chicken, during the 9 days. Now, it is post-Talmudic, which we're going to address soon how that is relevant. What we have to remember as well is that on Shabbos, there is absolutely no issue at all. So on Shabbos, we eat like on any other Shabbos. But due to the fact that it's post-Talmudic, there are those who believe that, yes, perhaps there is a minhag to avoid wine, but you cannot have a minhag that uproots a halacha that predates it. And since we are supposed to make havdalah on wine, there are those who believe that you should not be cutting out your wine from your havdalah. There are those who say it. Others, okay. Oh, so some wonder, can you bring in your Shabbat early? The answer is, it is 100% acceptable to bring in this Shabbat and obviously next Shabbat when it's during the 9 days early. As long as it's after Plag, we welcome Shabbos early, and you could sit down and eat your fleishiks and eat your, no question at all, 100% fine. Now, when it comes to Havdalah, although there are those who are going to use wine or grape juice, I think the general practice is that when it comes for Havdalah, and this year, by the way, it's 2 Havdalahs, right? It's the Havdalah this coming Motzei Shabbos, and then the Havdalah after Tisha B'Av, which we're going to discuss soon. Because remember, we extend the laws of the 9 days into the 10th day. So we have 2 Havdalahs that the custom by many is to avoid wine and grape juice. What do you use? Chamar Medina, meaning a beverage of choice of that region, which, as we know by now, beer obviously would be good, especially if it's an Ontario beer. Some very good beers in Ontario, by the way, made here, support local. And any honorable beverage, meaning Pepsi and Coke would not be an honorable beverage, but a good coffee would be a Chamar Medina, you can make Havdalah. Or a good apple cider would also be a Chamar Medina. If a person opens their refrigerator and they realize they have nothing else, it would be permissible to use grape juice due to the fact that the mitzvah of Havdalah predates these minhagim. Okay, now, fleishiks is avoided during the 9 days. There was a great rabbi in the 18th century, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, who believed that Motzei Shabbos, if you have left over Shabbos food, since it was acceptable on Shabbos to eat fleishiks, so you can eat it Motzei Shabbos as well. And there were actually communities that would allow a fleishik melava malka In general, Ashkenazim, we do not have that practice. Okay? So what do you do with your leftovers? That's why we have freezers, right? You put it in the freezer. I think everyone has their after, and always you have parents encouraging to eat as much fleischiks as you can on Shabbos, not to have too much leftovers, but that is what we do. Now, we all know, and as mentioned, the avoidance of meat and wine is post-Talmudic. And therefore, in a meal where traditionally you should have fleischiks, meaning a seudas mitzvah, it is permissible during the 9 days to have, it is permissible to have fleischiks. So therefore, a bris milah during the 9 days, you could have fleischiks. I've shared with you the story that 27 years ago, we had on the second day of the month of Av, we had, it was like this year, it was a Sunday, and we had the bris for our oldest son, Uzi, and we at the time did not have a fleishik meal, so we were going to have a milchik meal, but I had a friend and an uncle that called from Chicago and said they're coming in for the bris, but the only thing they say is that once they're driving all those hours, they expect the corned beef sandwich, meaning we're driving, but there better be fleischiks for us. So we had one section of fleischiks. Everyone else was eating cream cheese and bagel, and the Chicagoans had a nice corned beef sandwich waiting for them, and it was a sudas mitzvah. That's 100% acceptable. Now, it is very hard to arrange a bris milah or a pidyon haben to fall during the 9 days. So therefore, if it happens, it happens. However, what we are very familiar with is the fact that there's one sudas mitzvah that we can actually create. And that obviously is talking about a siyum maseches. When you finish a tractate of the Talmud, or you finish a book in Navi, and you studied it in depth, there's obviously a celebration. The way we Jews celebrate is with food and others together. You complete the tractate there, it elevates the experience to sudas mitzvah, and yes, you can have fleischiks. Fine? Now, the question is who could be part of it? So the poskim do say that anyone that you would in general invite to such an event could come and participate in the fleischiks. So in some restaurants I've heard in New York, they have a nightly siyum to allow people to eat fleischiks, where many rabbinic authorities are not so comfortable with it. There's even a debate among some authorities if it is permissible to delay a completion of a tractate to the 9 days just to be able to eat fleischiks. But I think the general practice is to be lenient. I had a very well honorable uncle, my late uncle Shlomo Sofer in Israel, who his father, who was a great Torah scholar, the great grandson of Chatam Sofer, had the practice of studying and then leaving the last few lines before completing it, delaying the actual siyum to the 9 days, and then have fleischiks. And I think the Daf Yomi actually finished Yuma today, and I wouldn't be surprised if many people are delaying the completion to the 9 days to have a nice fleishik meal. Now, by the way, yes, we avoid fleischiks during the 9 days, but if you are cooking Erev Shabbos and you taste a little bit of the food just to know that the flavoring is right. Today, people use recipes. But my grandmother, when she would cook, it was always relying on she never had a cookbook. It was all from memory. And the nice thing was that every week the kugel tasted differently. But often the way she would determine if enough salt or pepper is in is by tasting it. You could do it Friday because that's part of Koved Shabbos. That doesn't mean you could sit down and have a whole sample from your cholent, but a little bit just to know that it's right. If that's your routine for being sure that your food is Shabbos worthy, you get a green light to go ahead and do it. Now, among the more discussed and challenging halachas of the 9 days is the fact that we are told, again, in the Talmud, we are told that it's only the week of Tisha B'Av. Ashkenazim have a practice to begin already from Rosh Chodesh of no bathing and no showering. And this is mentioned in Shulchan Aruch. However, it would not create comfort for many, and that's putting it mildly, because not showering for a period of 8-9 days when the temperature is hot, and there is also an issue known as koved abrius, because the discomfort you might be causing is not just to yourself, but to others around you as well. I would say in most communities, even the most God-fearing communities, there's an understanding that the idea of not showering or bathing is for pleasure. But to go ahead and remove sweat, that is not for pleasure, but that is lehasir lichloch. It's like removing dirt, just as there's no question that if someone gets some dirt and some soil on their hand during the 9 days, there's no issue at all in washing it off. The same applies to perspiration and when it comes to sweat as well. And therefore, the minute I grew up with is that during the 9 days, you don't take a hot shower for pleasure. You make it a touch colder than usual, and you obviously use soap and shampoo, but the goal is not to remain in the shower for the enjoyment of it. Do what you need to do and come out. That's what I grew up with at home. That's what I learned from my father, and that's what I've heard from great poskim, and that is what we rely on, most of us, because I've shared with you the fact that in the summer of 1987, I spent over a month in Cleveland, Ohio, and actually a suburb of Cleveland known as Wickliffe, where my grandparents, my mother's parents, lived, and my Zaidi was a Yekka, a God-fearing Yekka, but he did not have the Litvish traditions of leniency. And it made its appearance in many, many areas. And I remember as a child learning that there's a big difference between how Zaidi does things and Abba and my father does things. While my father was the Litvish one who knew how to come up with the leniency, Zaidi did not know how to come up with the leniency. And therefore, while I was there during the 9 days, the policy was clear: no shower. And even on Erev Shabbos, Zaidi showed me in the Mishnah Berurah where there's only a leniency for Panav, Yodav, Veraglov, face, hands, and feet, nothing else. That's what Zaidi said. And I had no choice. I wasn't, I had to do what he said. So I turned to Zaidi and I said to him, they say in the name of Ramosha that nowadays in North America, it's hot and we are not accustomed to not shower. We are considered an istinist, someone that's finicky. And therefore, there's a leniency from Ramosha to take a shower. I remember asking him that. And Zaidi responded, something I'll remember forever, that if Ramosha would have made or would have stated all the heterim, all the leniencies they say in his name, he would have to live 2,000 years. That's what Zaidi said. Meaning it's impossible that all these heterim. Okay, now I still believe I was right, that Ramosha did say it, and I found it afterwards in writing. But kachazeh, you're in Cleveland, you're in by Zaidi's house, you do what Zaidi says. So that was the practice, and I remember him, and he inspired me, obviously. But I follow the practice of my father, where showers are taken not for pleasure, but rather to remove sweat. On Erev Shabbos, by the way, it's a hot shower. Why? That's the minig, lekovid Shabbos. It's clearly lekovid Shabbos to go ahead and do it. Now, usually when it comes to halachos of the 9 days, we talk a little bit about Erev Tisha B'Av and the fact that according to the Gemara, you are not supposed to have 2 cooked items on that last meal. So we talk often about how and what is the proper structure of Erev Tisha B'Av and the requirements for that last meal before the fast. This year is different because Erev Tisha B'Av is on Shabbos. And on Shabbos, you do not act like a mourner. And therefore, what you do is you have an earlier mincha. Here at Bnei Torah, it's going to be at 6 p.m. And I'm sure shuls around are going to also have an earlier one. And then you have a meal like any other Shabbos meal. The language of the Shulchan Aruch about what you should be placing on that meal is that since it is Shabbos, even though it is the last meal before the fast, nevertheless, ma'aleh al shulchano, you could place on your table, afilu keseudat Shlomo be'et malchuto. You could put on your table a royal feast like Shlomo HaMelech. In no way should the Tisha B'Av environment, in no way should the Tisha B'Av way of thinking impact your Shabbos meal. That's what we are told. Now, what is the order of things after Shabbos ends? So it works as follows. When Shabbos ends, 9:40, what you're going to do is you're going to say, Baruch Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'chol. So it's a statement that you end your Shabbos. And you take off your Shabbos shoes and you put on your Tisha B'Av shoes, which don't have leather in them. Now, Havdalah over a cup is not made on Motzei Shabbos. That is done after the fast. Okay, it's important to remember. What you do is there is a Havdalah that is said in your Shmoneh Esrei during Ma'ariv. Okay, so here in Shul, I think we're going to schedule it some 35 minutes after Shabbos ends. We're going to have a Ma'ariv here. You could come with a vehicle if you come, or any shul you do go, or if you don't, you have a Ma'ariv. I think we'll have a Zoom access as well. And in your Ma'ariv, you say the Havdalah, Atochen Antonu. After Shmoneh Esrei, we light a candle and say, Borei Ma'orei Ha'esh, and so too if you are at home. On Tisha B'Av, there will not be psamim, but there will be a bracha on fire. And then, after the fast, before you eat, you make a Havdalah on beer, cider, coffee, or if needed, grape juice. And the Havdalah Sunday night after Tisha B'Av, so again, that's a week from this coming Sunday, is just the bracha on the beverage, either shahak or labor priyagafen, and then Hamavdim and Kodesh L'chol ben Lachosha. No need for a candle because that was used already on Motzei Shabbos 24 hours earlier. And so too, no bisamim at all. Okay, so these are a few of the halachas that relate to the 9 days. Now, the Chafetz Chaim bemoans a practice that I have not seen, but the fact that he addresses it indicates that it was prevalent in Europe. And he complains about the fact that as people would be sitting on the floor to read the Eicha and the Kinos on the eve of Tisha B'Av, people would be throwing towards one another these thorn balls. That's what he talks about. And it seemed to be some activity of fun, that they would take one and you would throw it at someone else, and then they would throw it to the next person. So the Chafetz Chaim, quoting the Chayei Adam, says, Ra alaya ma'aseh. This is very disturbing, that here you have this action, this activity that is one that does not belong in a shul, and how much more so on a day of mourning, on the day of Tisha B'Av, to go ahead and have this game. He saw it as very problematic. Fine. So some years ago, I read in Shuva from a Rabbi Waltz who was in Budapest, and he had Hasidic roots, and he defended the practice. Now, by him defending the practice in Hungary indicates that it was prevalent, that even Hungarian Jews had such a practice. And what he writes is that there is such sadness on Tisha B'Av. We are so down. We need those little boosters. We need something to boost our spirits. And therefore, the practice that existed that perhaps put a smile on people, that they're chucking this little ball and throwing it at people, perhaps it was there to balance. In other words, yes, it's a time to be mindful. And yes, it's a time of sadness. And yes, it's a time to focus on everything that is simply not right with the world we live in. Things are simply not right, right? And especially when it comes to this year, the tsaris we've dealt with. When it comes to COVID, people that have not recovered. When it comes to concern of a new variant, that's a concern. This is not something that's easy to deal with. When it comes to the tragedy in Miran, when it comes to the tragedy in Surfside, we're dealing with a whole series of things that are not right. The world is not the way it should be. Something is, as they say, is messed up. And we Jews believe that with a structure that unifies us, we have a way of connecting to the Creator, and God Almighty will look over us and be sure that things are right. So it is a time to focus, but it brings sadness. It has its place, but you got to balance it. Don't overdo it. Meaning, for some people, they need a reminder it's a time of sadness, but some people need something to boost their spirits. And perhaps the throwing of the thorns was there to boost people who are on the border of becoming depressed, which is obviously not what this era or this period is about. And I always look for statements of uplifting statements. In other words, when I review the halachot of the 9 days, I look for things that are uplifting. So I would like to share with you 2 brief thoughts as we wrap up here. Number 1, on a regular year, when Erev Tisha B'Av is not on Shabbos, we're supposed to have a limited meal beforehand. Minhag Yisrael is that we have a nice, large meal before Mincha, and then the Talmudic meal of only one cooked item with bread, eggs, ashes after Mincha. Now, some commentators know that, that big meal before Mincha looks like a festive meal, and that's problematic, right? Because you work it out that by the time you eat the roll and the egg, you barely need food. So it comes out that your significant meal before Tisha B'Av borders on a festive one. Comes the Magen Avraham, great Rav Avram Gombiner, and he says to us the following: you should know the reason we have, yes, a festive meal before Tisha B'Av, not the one after Mincha, the one before on most years, is because once upon a time Tisha B'Av was a day of celebration. When they had a Beis Hamikdash, it was a day of celebration. And one day it will become again a day of celebration. To commemorate that concept and to show our optimism that we believe in that structure returning and us returning to Eretz Yisrael and meriting that good world, to commemorate that, we have the festive meal. Meaning within Tisha B'Av itself, there are elements of happiness because we, in essence, are optimists. We know that there are better days ahead. And the fact that Tisha B'Av actually is labeled a moed. We don't say tachnun on Tisha B'Av. Why? It's labeled a moed. It's to remind us, yes, we're sad, but when we do things right and we get our act together, better days are waiting for us. That's what's important to keep in mind as we experience this period. It's a period to experience, right? Sadness, yes, but optimism as well. What I love ending with is always the fact that right after Tisha B'Av, we focus on a few of the halachos that relate to Zecher Lamigdash, to commemorate the temple. And we focus as well on halachos that when we see the location where the temple was, we do Kriya. You all know that when you come to the Kosel and you see the Temple Mount and you see a structure that doesn't belong there, you do Kriya. You rend your garments because you mourn the fact that there's no Beis Hamikdash there. Now, if you look at Talmudic literature, you'll note that you're supposed to do Kriya on Yerushalayim as well. Meaning when you see the city of Yerushalayim, even before the Temple Mount, even before the Har HaBayit, you're supposed to do Kriya. But that's not done. Why? Explains Ramosha Feinstein. Nowadays, although there is still a requirement for Kriya, for Mekom HaMikdash, for the location of the temple of the Beis HaMikdash, for Yerushalayim, there's no longer a requirement because Yerushalayim nowadays is Bnuya Lesiferes. Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, is a built city. And it's one we are very proud of. It's a city, it's a glorified, it's a beautiful, it's a magnificent. There's life there. There's Jews in Yerushalayim. And we have to celebrate it. In other words, yes, we are mindful of the fact that things are not the way they should be, and we are still missing some key pieces in this puzzle, but we've started to see things, and that should encourage us to do our part, to be mindful during this period of time, to work on improvement, and hopefully that blend of sadness with optimism, with an understanding that the Almighty is already indicating that, hey, the Jews are returning to Israel, the Jews return to Jerusalem, we're going to merit the next step. That's what we hope for, and that's perhaps the way we should approach this period of time. I would like to thank again our sponsors for our learning tonight, Danny Weisblatt, who is sponsored to commemorate the yard site of Aaron Gudel ben Nosson, Neshama Shav and Aliyah. Also, thank you to Sandy and Nachum Wolf, who sponsored to commemorate the yard site of Sandy and Aviva Waznika's mother, Esther Bluma, Bat Pinchas V'Chana, Miriam, Neshama Shav and Aliyah. Thank you, everyone, for participating in our learning tonight.